Hey guys, we're going to start tonight by taking a look at the most heinous acts that monarchs have ever undertaken in order to maintain their thrones. Kings are frequently remembered in history as valiant monarchs, warriors, or empire builders. Beneath the crowns and splendor, however, are tales of horror, cruelty, and paranoia. Choices taken out of fear of losing power rather than wisdom. From antiquity to the present, monarchs have demonstrated that their own subjects, their families, their aristocracy, and their rivals were more often than not the biggest dangers to their thrones. Additionally, some kings breached boundaries that still shock us today in order to maintain their rule. Thus, keep an eye out if that sounds like something you'd be interested in. Additionally, tell us where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you in the comments section. Seeing who is coming from all around the world is always entertaining. For a gentle background hum, switch on the fan and dim the lights. And let's take it slow as we embark on our journey tonight. Few monarchs in history embody their chosen epithet as fully as Ivan IV of Russia, known to the world as Ivan the Terrible. His reign in the 16th century transformed Russia from a fragmented medieval state into a centralized autocracy, laying the foundations of the Russian Empire. But the price of this transformation was unimaginable violence, paranoia, and bloodshed. To secure his throne, Ivan unleashed horrors on nobles, peasants, and even his own family, leaving behind a legacy both feared and remembered. Ivan was born in 1530 into the ruling Rurik dynasty. His early years were marked not by stability, but by trauma. His father, Grand Prince Vasily III, died when Ivan was only 3 years old, leaving the boy ruler in name, but vulnerable to manipulation. His mother, Yelena Glinskaya, served as regent, but she died suddenly when Ivan was 8, likely poisoned. In the power vacuum, rival boyar families, the Russian nobility, vied for control of the young prince and the throne. Ivan grew up surrounded by intrigue, betrayal, and violence. Accounts describe how the boyars neglected him, even subjecting him to humiliation and abuse. These formative experiences instilled in Ivan a lifelong hatred and suspicion of the nobility, a paranoia that would later fuel his reign of terror. At age 16, Ivan was crowned with the title of Tsar of all Rus, the first Russian ruler to adopt this imperial designation. The ceremony was rich with symbolism, tying his authority to both Byzantine and Mongol traditions. With this new title, Ivan sought not only to claim power, but to assert that his rule came directly from God, beyond challenge, beyond restraint. In the early years, there was hope. Ivan enacted reforms that suggested wisdom and vision. He established a code of laws, reorganized the military, and called a representative assembly, the Zemsky Sobor. He expanded Russia's territory, pushing into Kazan and Astrakhan, bringing the Volga under Moscow's control. For a brief moment, it seemed that Ivan might become a strong but just ruler, remembered for progress rather than terror. But behind the reforms simmered a darker side. Ivan's violent temper, combined with deep-seated paranoia, soon erupted. The death of his beloved wife, Anastasia Romanovna, in 1560 marked a turning point. Ivan suspected that she had been poisoned by boyars. Whether true or not, it confirmed his belief that his enemies surrounded him. The grief and rage that followed transformed him into something far more dangerous, a ruler who saw betrayal everywhere and responded with merciless cruelty. What followed was the creation of a system of fear unlike anything Russia had seen before. Ivan's answer to insecurity was not compromise, but domination. His reign, once hopeful, was about to descend into the abyss of suspicion, torture, and mass execution. In 1565, Ivan IV introduced a terrifying new system that reshaped Russia, the oprichnina. On the surface, it was a political division of the realm. In reality, it was Ivan's instrument of absolute power, a state within a state that gave him unchecked authority to purge his enemies. The oprichnina carved Russia into two parts. One was ruled conventionally by the boyars and existing institutions. The other, the oprichnina proper, was Ivan's personal domain controlled directly by him and his loyal enforcers, the oprichniki. These black-clad riders, mounted on horses draped with dogs' heads and brooms, symbolized their mission to sniff out treason like hounds and sweep away all opposition. The oprichniki became infamous for their brutality. They tortured, executed, and confiscated lands from nobles accused, often without proof, of disloyalty. Entire families were destroyed, their estates handed over to Ivan's loyalists. Villages were burned, peasants slaughtered, and terror spread like wildfire across the land. To be accused was often enough to seal one's fate. One of the most notorious episodes of Ivan's reign was the massacre of Novgorod in 1570. Ivan suspected the wealthy and semi-autonomous city of plotting treason, possibly conspiring with Lithuania. His response was devastating. For weeks, oprichniki unleashed horror upon Novgorod's citizens. Men, women, and children were tortured, drowned in the freezing Volkhov River, or executed in gruesome public spectacles. Estimates of the dead range from thousands to tens of thousands. The massacre not only destroyed Novgorod's autonomy, but also served as a brutal warning to the rest of Russia. No city, no noble, no subject was beyond Ivan's wrath. The terror extended even to the clergy. The Russian Orthodox Church, once a check on Tsarist power, was not immune. Monasteries were raided, and priests who opposed Ivan's excesses were punished. Yet at the same time, Ivan cloaked his reign in religious justification, presenting himself as God's chosen ruler, purging the sinful to purify the realm. Psychologically, Ivan seemed consumed by contradictions. He was capable of moments of deep piety and penitence, followed by acts of unimaginable cruelty. He could commission a new church, then order a massacre the next day. He demanded loyalty, yet trusted no one, not even his closest advisors. His paranoia deepened with every act of violence, creating a vicious cycle where fear bred more cruelty and cruelty bred more fear. The oprichnina devastated Russia's economy and population. Once prosperous lands were left desolate, peasants fled, and famine spread. Yet Ivan clung to it as a tool of survival, convinced that terror was the only way to preserve his throne. In his mind, mercy was weakness, and power was maintained only by blood. By the late 1570s, Ivan IV was no longer the promising young reformer of his early reign, nor even the coldly rational tyrant of the Oprichnina. He had become something darker, a man consumed by paranoia, rage, and a near pathological distrust of everyone around him. And as his suspicions grew, even his own family became targets of his violence. The most infamous moment of Ivan's reign came in 1581, during a heated argument with his eldest son and heir, Tsarevich Ivan Ivanovich. Accounts vary on the details, but the essence remains the same. Ivan struck his son in a fit of rage, using his staff to deliver a fatal blow. When the young Tsarevich collapsed, mortally wounded, Ivan was overcome with grief. Chroniclers describe the Tsar cradling his dying son, wailing with horror at what he had done. The image of Ivan the Terrible and his son Ivan, immortalized centuries later in Ilya Repin's haunting painting, captures this moment of raw agony. But remorse did not undo the damage. By killing his heir, Ivan destroyed his dynasty's stability. His younger son, Fyodor, would inherit the throne, but Fyodor was weak and incapable of ruling effectively. The vacuum left by Ivan's act would plunge Russia into the time of troubles, a period of famine, civil war, and foreign intervention. Even before his son's death, Ivan's later years had been marked by decline. The economy was devastated by his wars and the destruction wrought by the Oprichnina. The once mighty Russian state groaned under heavy taxation and depopulation as peasants fled their lands to escape oppression. His foreign campaigns also soured. While Ivan had early successes against Kazan and Astrakhan, his long and costly attempt to conquer Livonia ended in failure, draining Russia's resources and leaving its western borders vulnerable. Physically, Ivan's health deteriorated. Years of stress, violence, and possible mercury treatments for illness left him frail and erratic. Yet he continued to lash out violently until the very end. In 1584, while preparing for a game of chess, Ivan collapsed and died suddenly at age 53. His legacy was as complex as it was terrifying. On one hand, he centralized power, expanded Russia's borders, and laid the groundwork for the future tsardom and empire. On the other, he left behind a shattered economy, a traumatized population, and a legacy of fear. The very system of autocratic rule he built survived him, becoming a defining feature of Russian governance for centuries. To Russians of his time, Ivan was both protector and destroyer. To history, he became the embodiment of how paranoia and unchecked power can turn a ruler into a tyrant. Like Herod and Nero before him, Ivan proved that when fear rules a throne, cruelty follows, and not even blood ties can guarantee safety. When Charles IX ascended the French throne in 1560, he was only 10 years old. France at the time was a kingdom teetering on the edge of collapse. The Protestant Reformation had divided Europe, and nowhere were the divisions sharper than in France. Catholic and Protestant factions, the latter known as Huguenots, were locked in escalating conflict that often spilled into open warfare. Charles was born into this storm in 1550, the second son of Henry II and Catherine de' Medici. His elder brother, Francis II, reigned briefly, but died at just 16, leaving Charles to inherit a throne already weakened by factionalism. At his coronation, Charles was too young to rule independently, so the burden fell on his mother, Catherine, who became regent and the true power behind the throne. Catherine de' Medici was a shrewd political operator. Surrounded by ambitious noble families, particularly the Catholic House of Guise and the Protestant-aligned House of Bourbon, she sought to balance the factions while keeping royal authority intact. Her methods were often ruthless, but her position was precarious. She needed Charles to embody strength, yet he was impressionable, timid, and deeply reliant on her guidance. France soon descended into a series of civil wars known as the French Wars of Religion. Violence between Catholics and Protestants erupted across the kingdom. Churches were burned, massacres carried out, and entire towns destroyed. Though treaties were signed, peace never lasted long. Charles IX, caught between powerful factions, vacillated in his decisions. His reign became one long attempt to hold together a country tearing itself apart. One of Catherine's strategies was to arrange a marriage that might reconcile the warring sides. She proposed that Charles's sister, Margaret of Valois, marry the Protestant leader, Henry of Navarre, the future Henry IV of France. It was a bold move, uniting a Catholic princess with a Protestant noble in hopes of fostering peace. The wedding was set for August 1572 in Paris, drawing nobles and leaders from both factions to the capital. But beneath the pageantry and celebration lurked tension. The Catholic elite, particularly the Guise family, despised the union. Protestants saw it as a chance to strengthen their influence, while Catholics feared it would undermine the faith. Charles IX himself wavered, pressured by advisors and his domineering mother. The wedding, rather than uniting the kingdom, became the spark for one of the most horrific massacres in European history. For Charles, it was the moment his reign would forever be defined by, an eruption of blood that stained his crown and earned him a place among history's most infamous kings. The wedding of Margaret of Valois and Henry of Navarre in August 1572 was meant to be a symbol of reconciliation between France's warring Catholic and Protestant factions. Instead, it became the stage for one of the most horrific bloodbaths of the 16th century, the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. In the days following the wedding, tensions in Paris were razor sharp. Thousands of Protestant nobles and leaders had gathered in the city to celebrate, and for the Catholic hardliners, especially the powerful Guise family, this was both a threat and an opportunity. On August 22nd, just days after the wedding, a shocking event occurred, an assassination attempt on Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, one of the most important Huguenot leaders and a trusted ally of the Protestant cause. He survived, but the attempt inflamed suspicions. The Huguenots believed Catholic extremists were behind the attack. Rumors of retaliation swirled, and Paris braced for unrest. Catherine de' Medici, terrified that the Huguenots might seize control of the king and plunge the capital into rebellion, persuaded her son Charles IX that drastic action was needed. Historians still debate her exact role, but what followed was a decision that changed France forever. On the night of August 23rd, 24th, 1572, the King's Council resolved to eliminate the Protestant leadership in Paris. What began as a targeted strike quickly spiraled out of control. In the early hours of St. Bartholomew's Day, the bell of Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois tolled, and violence erupted across the city. The Guise faction led the charge, storming Coligny's residence. Dragged from his bed, the admiral was murdered and his body hurled into the street. Once the first blow was struck, the killings spread like wildfire. Huguenot nobles who had come to Paris for the wedding festivities were hunted down in their lodgings and slaughtered. But the violence did not stop with the elites. Ordinary Parisians, inflamed by years of religious hatred and stirred by the bloodshed, joined the frenzy. They stormed Protestant homes, dragged men, women, and children into the streets, and butchered them mercilessly. The Seine ran red with bodies. Eyewitnesses described the streets filled with corpses, houses looted, and mobs chanting religious slogans as they killed. King Charles IX himself reportedly watched some of the massacre unfold from the Louvre. At first, he may have intended only to eliminate a few key Protestant leaders, but once the killing began, he sanctioned the broader bloodletting. When asked later why he allowed it, he allegedly replied, "Then kill them all, so that none are left to reproach me." For several days, Paris was consumed by slaughter. Estimates vary, but in the capital alone, between 3,000 and 5,000 Protestants were killed. The violence spread beyond the city to the provinces, where Catholic mobs carried out further massacres. Across France, as many as 10,000 to 30,000 Huguenots perished. What was meant to be a political strike became a national tragedy. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre cemented Charles IX's reputation as a weak and bloody monarch, manipulated by his mother and trapped in the violence of his age. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre left France drenched in blood, and Charles IX forever stained by it. Instead of reconciling Catholics and Protestants, the massacre deepened the divisions. Trust was shattered. For the Huguenots who survived, the memory of betrayal, a royal wedding that had lured them to Paris only to end in slaughter, became an open wound that would fuel decades of war. Internationally, the massacre sent shockwaves across Europe. Catholic powers like Spain and the papacy rejoiced. Pope Gregory XIII even held a Te Deum Mass in celebration, and a commemorative medal was struck to mark the slaughter of Protestants. But Protestant nations were horrified. In England, Queen Elizabeth I received the news with disgust, and in the German states, Protestant rulers condemned France as treacherous. The French crown's reputation abroad plummeted, and Charles IX was seen less as a sovereign and more as a butcher. For Charles himself, the massacre marked a point of no return. Though he had ordered the killings under pressure from his mother and advisors, the scale of the bloodshed tormented him. He became increasingly unstable in the years that followed, racked by guilt and paranoia. Chroniclers describe the young king, still in his early 20s, as sleepless and haunted. He reportedly wandered the halls of the Louvre at night, muttering that he could smell the stench of corpses, that he heard their screams echoing in his ears. His health began to fail, not only from the stress, but also from tuberculosis, which ravaged his body. Meanwhile, France remained in turmoil. Instead of quelling the wars of religion, the massacre had reignited them. The Huguenots, betrayed and decimated, rallied around leaders like Henry of Navarre. Civil war flared up once more, and Charles IX found himself presiding over a kingdom that seemed cursed by endless bloodshed. By 1574, just 2 years after the massacre, Charles IX was a broken man. Coughing blood and wasted by disease, he retreated to his palace at Vincennes. Surrounded by his mother and a handful of courtiers, he died at only 23 years old. His final words, according to some reports, were bitter. He lamented the massacre, confessing that he was lost, damned by the oceans of blood spilled under his reign. Charles was succeeded by his younger brother, Henry III, but the damage had been done. The Valois dynasty was fatally weakened, and the French crown would struggle for decades to restore stability. The massacre not only destroyed Charles IX's reputation, but also ensured his reign would be remembered as one of treachery, fear, and horror. Charles IX is a reminder of what happens when weak rulers are swept up by stronger wills and violent times. He was neither the visionary of a unifier, nor the calculating strength of a tyrant. He was a frightened boy king, manipulated into committing one of the greatest atrocities of the Renaissance. In the early 19th century, Southern Africa was transformed by the rise of a leader whose name still evokes both admiration and fear: Shaka Zulu. He was a military innovator, a unifier of clans, and the founder of the Zulu kingdom. But his reign was also marked by violence, ruthless discipline, and terror, a rule that secured his power but cost countless lives. Shaka was born around 1787, the illegitimate son of a minor Zulu chief, Senzengagkona, and a woman named Nundi. His early life was difficult. Because of his illegitimacy, he and his mother were cast out, and Shaka grew up facing humiliation and hardship. Yet these early struggles forged in him resilience and ambition. He entered the military system of the neighboring Muthetwa people, where he distinguished himself as a fearless warrior. What set Shaka apart was not only his physical prowess, but also his brilliance as a strategist. By his early 20s, he had caught the attention of the Muthetwa chief Dingiswayo, who made him commander. It was here that Shaka began to experiment with new military techniques that would revolutionize warfare in the region. Traditionally, African warfare had been ritualized and relatively limited in bloodshed, with long throwing spears, assegai, and loose formations. Shaka broke from this pattern. He introduced the short stabbing spear, the ikloa, designed for brutal close combat. He reorganized the Zulu warriors into regiments called impi, drilled relentlessly in new tactics. Instead of loose skirmishes, Shaka taught his men to fight in the bull's horns formation. The center, the chest, engaged the enemy, while the flanks, the horns, swept around to encircle them, and the reserves, the loins, reinforced as needed. These innovations turned the Zulu into a fearsome fighting force. Shaka's rise to power came in 1816, after Dingiswayo's death in battle. With the support of his warriors, Shaka overthrew his half-brother Sejuana and claimed leadership of the Zulu. From that moment, he set out to transform a small clan into a dominant kingdom. Shaka's military campaigns were ruthless. Neighboring tribes were either absorbed into his growing Zulu nation or destroyed. Those who resisted were crushed with merciless efficiency. Survivors, especially young men, were often incorporated into his army, while others were scattered, creating waves of displacement and violence across southern Africa in a period known as the Mafekane, or the Crushing. Inside his kingdom, Shaka ruled with absolute authority. Discipline was severe. Cowardice or disobedience in battle was punished by death. His soldiers were forbidden to marry until they had proven themselves in combat, ensuring that their loyalty remained undivided. Shaka's word was law, and questioning it meant execution. To his followers, he was a visionary who forged unity out of chaos. To his enemies, and even many of his own people, he was a tyrant whose iron hand crushed opposition without mercy. But Shaka's reign of terror was only beginning. Once Shaka consolidated his power as chief of the Zulu, he unleashed a wave of conquests that transformed the political map of southern Africa. From a relatively small clan, he built a centralized, disciplined kingdom that struck fear into all who encountered it. But his methods were as terrifying as they were effective. Shaka's armies were unmatched in discipline. Warriors trained constantly, marching barefoot across thorn-strewn landscapes to harden their feet. They were forbidden to wear sandals to ensure stamina. Drills were relentless. Battles were merciless. Cowards were executed on the spot. Success was rewarded with honor, cattle, and prestige. Failure brought death. The result was an army that obeyed Shaka's every command without hesitation. His military campaigns soon expanded beyond the Zulu heartland. Shaka turned his eyes to surrounding clans, demanding submission. Those who resisted were annihilated. Entire villages were wiped out, their cattle seized, their survivors absorbed into Zulu regiments or driven into exile. The devastation caused by these campaigns triggered the Mafekane, or the Crushing, a period of massive upheaval across southern Africa. Displaced tribes, fleeing the Zulu advance, crashed into other territories, sparking a chain reaction of wars, migrations, and societal collapse. Shaka also employed psychological terror as a weapon. Captives were sometimes executed in public, their deaths serving as a warning to others. Tales of Zulu brutality spread quickly, magnifying fear and often causing enemies to flee before the battle even began. For Shaka, terror was not merely cruelty, it was strategy. Yet his reign was not only about conquest. Shaka also reorganized Zulu society to match his militarized vision. Age-based regiments were created, each with its own identity and homestead. Men lived in military barracks and could not marry until they had served. Women were organized into complementary regiments, tasked with providing supplies and support. This system made the Zulu nation not just an army, but a society built around perpetual readiness for war. Inside his kingdom, however, Shaka's iron rule grew harsher with time. He demanded absolute loyalty and brooked no dissent. Chiefs who questioned him were executed. Entire clans were uprooted and resettled to weaken opposition. Even within his inner circle, fear was constant. Shaka's volatile temper meant that those who once enjoyed his favor could quickly find themselves condemned to death. The scale of violence under Shaka was unprecedented in the region. Historians estimate that during the Mfecane, hundreds of thousands of people may have died, either directly in battle or indirectly through famine, displacement, and disease caused by the chaos. While Shaka built an empire, he also unleashed suffering on a staggering scale. By the early 1820s, Shaka Zulu was both feared and respected across southern Africa. His kingdom stood as a testament to his genius as a military innovator, and as a warning of what happens when absolute power is enforced through terror. But Shaka's reign of cruelty was not yet at its peak. His paranoia, like Herod's and Ivan the Terrible's before him, would soon turn inward, consuming even those closest to him. In 1827, tragedy struck the Zulu kingdom with the death of Shaka's beloved mother, Nandi. Though Shaka had long ruled with an iron fist, Nandi's presence had been a source of stability in his life. Her death shattered him. Consumed by grief, he unleashed a wave of cruelty and madness upon his people that revealed the darker extremes of his rule. Shaka decreed a period of mourning unlike anything seen before. Normal life in the kingdom was suspended. Planting of crops was forbidden, causing widespread hunger. Pregnant women were executed, as Shaka declared that no new life should come into the world while he grieved his mother's death. Calves were slaughtered to ensure no milk was available, symbolizing the absence of nurturing. Men and women who were deemed insufficiently mournful were put to death. The scale of the executions was staggering. Thousands were killed for failing to show adequate sorrow, for minor infractions of mourning laws, or simply to demonstrate Shaka's power. The land, already scarred by years of war, was plunged into deeper despair. What had begun as a period of mourning became an orgy of terror, remembered for generations as one of the darkest episodes in Zulu history. Shaka's paranoia, already strong, grew more acute in these years. He became convinced that conspiracies surrounded him. Spies were everywhere. Loyalty was tested constantly. He executed trusted advisors and commanders on suspicion of treason. Even his brothers, Dingane and Glengana, fell under suspicion. While grief had triggered the spiral, power magnified it. Shaka's reign now resembled that of other infamous tyrants of history, rulers like Ivan the Terrible and Nero, whose paranoia turned allies into enemies and family into victims. What had once been military discipline and strategic terror degenerated into chaotic brutality. The kingdom suffered, morale plummeted, and resentment brewed among his people. Despite this, Shaka continued to dream of expansion. He envisioned campaigns that would push the Zulu kingdom far beyond its current borders. He even spoke of invading distant lands. Some accounts suggest he planned expeditions northwards or even toward the coast to confront European traders. His ambition knew no bounds, but his people were exhausted, his army strained, and his rule increasingly resented. By 1828, Shaka's cruelty had become unbearable even to those closest to him. The seeds of betrayal were planted. His brothers Dingane and Langana, once his subordinates, began to conspire against him. They realized that if Shaka's reign continued unchecked, the Zulu kingdom might not survive entirely under the weight of his tyranny. Like so many rulers before him, Shaka had risen to greatness through vision and fear, and like them, he was about to be undone by the very paranoia and violence that had sustained him. By 1828, Shaka's grip on the Zulu kingdom was slipping. His relentless wars, his extreme mourning decrees, and his waves of executions had left the people exhausted and resentful. Once a respected warrior king who had united clans under the Zulu banner, he was now feared as a tyrant whose paranoia knew no limits. Even his own brothers realized that if Shaka remained in power, the kingdom itself might not survive. The conspirators were Dingane and Langana, Shaka's half-brothers, joined by a trusted ally named Mbopa. Together they plotted to rid themselves and the nation of Shaka's rule. On September 24, 1828, they struck. According to tradition, the assassination took place near Shaka's kraal at Kwadukuza. Shaka was caught off guard with little protection. Dingane and Langana, seizing the moment, drove their spears into him. As he fell, he is said to have uttered bitter words to his assassins. "You are killing me, thinking you will rule, but you will not. The swallows will devour you." With that, the most feared man in southern Africa was dead. The aftermath was swift. Dingane took power, but his reign would be fraught with its own challenges and betrayals. The kingdom Shaka had built endured, but it would never again expand with the same ferocity. His assassination marked both the end of an era and the survival of the Zulu people, spared from the further extremes of his paranoia. Shaka's legacy remains deeply contested. To some, he was a visionary military leader, a nation builder, whose innovations in warfare created one of the most formidable African states of the 19th century. His bull's horns formation and strict regimental system are still studied as examples of tactical brilliance. Without Shaka, the Zulu might have remained a minor clan instead of a regional power. But to others, he was a tyrant whose reign of terror cost countless lives. The Mfasane, set in motion by his conquests, displaced entire populations and unleashed suffering across South Africa. His mourning decrees after his mother's death remain infamous as an example of cruelty fueled by grief and paranoia. What is undeniable is Shaka's impact. Like Ivan the Terrible or Qin Shi Huang, he fused genius with brutality, creating a legacy that was both foundational and horrifying. He demonstrated how a ruler could build power through discipline and terror, but also how unchecked paranoia could destroy even the strongest leader. In the end, Shaka Zulu lived and died by the spear. He forged an empire with it, and he fell to it at the hands of his own kin. His story is a stark reminder that in the struggle for power, the greatest danger often comes not from outside enemies, but from within.